Hello, everyone. Thanks ever so much for joining us this evening. It's really nice to have you here for this session, which is a research seminar being run and having been organised by the Centre for Research in Film and Audiovisual Cultures at Roehampton. And I recognise some of you from our centre and some of you from our institution, but I can also see that there are some people who are not from inside the institution. So a warm welcome to you from us on the remote side of Roehampton University this evening. My name is Caroline Bainbridge and I'm one of the centre co-directors. I'm aware that a couple of centre members are coming directly from other teaching, so they'll be joining a couple of minutes late. So please can you indulge me as I kind of keep an eye on the participants and the chat and try to let people in. Just on the question of protocol, could you please make sure that you're all muted for the time being? This would help to make sure that Lucy isn't interrupted by any background sounds and so on. I realise that postal deliveries are coming at all times of the day at the moment in the COVID context, and that family pets often have something to say about what time they'd like to get fed and so on. So I am going to suggest that we keep questions for Lucy until the end of her talk, although I realise that actually on Zoom, it's very handy that we've got the chat function, because it does mean that you can record your thoughts or your questions as they occur to you, and we can keep those at the end and then we use them as prompts for our discussion. So feel free to kind of post your comment or idea or question in the chat as we go along, and we'll come back to them once Lucy's finished making her presentation. So I'm just going to start formally by welcoming Lucy. It's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Stroud to present her work today. Lucy gained her PhD quite recently from the University of Aberdeen, where the research underpinning her talk was grounded in real-life magazines, and she took a particular interest in a psychosocial approach. So Lucy's project also drew very extensively on her own substantial experience as a journalist working on real-life magazines, as well as other national titles. So she comes with a wealth of experience in the tabloid sector. And her research here really highlights the neoliberal agenda that is at work in the production and consumption of real-life magazines. And so she's interested in examining their emotional and psychosocial impact on us as readers, and of course on the broader media environment. So she's really interested in themes of socio and economic and political loss, and she tries to take a psychosocial approach to explore the psychical implications of this particular genre of magazines and their inscription in a very classed and gendered form of melancholia. And Lucy's currently working on various publications arising from this work, and so there'll be plenty of opportunity to have a chat with her about that. I think Lucy's going to talk for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll pick up on discussion from there. So thanks very much, Lucy. Over to you, and I think you've got the rights to share whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen first to make sure that's all up and running. Nope. Great. Okay, so hello and thank you very much for everyone coming to this seminar. Today I'm going to be talking about melancholic communities and real-life women's magazines. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you, Professor Caroline Bainbridge, for inviting me. Before I start, I just wanted to give a content warning, because some of my slides, there are references to sexual violence, and I understand if people would prefer to leave, but I just thought I should highlight that at the very beginning. So today I am going to be discussing real-life women's magazines and how they can be read through a psychosocial lens as a symptom of an emerging social melancholia that began to form from the late 1970s in the UK. I will be discussing the social context for the creation of real-life magazines, how this can be linked to what I term social melancholia, and how the affective excess of these losses have become productive in creating melancholic communities that can be read as a replacement for much of what was lost during this period. So my interest in real-life magazines began when I was a journalist for one of the largest independent press agencies in the UK. My job was to source and sell real-life stories to magazines and national newspapers. I came to thoroughly understand what topics sold for the most money and interviewed hundreds of women, giving me an insight into why women were selling these experiences and what the motivation was behind it. After the agency, I worked freelance for numerous tabloid newspapers and magazines, predominantly sourcing the real-life content, covering high-profile murder cases, stories of sexual violence, and other abuses. After many years, I decided to return to academia, to work through and make sense of those years, asking questions such as why was this genre so popular? Why was it that real-life magazines only seemed to feature the harrowing ordeals of their interviewees? When and how did this genre even begin to form? And why did it seem to be only women from poorer backgrounds who appeared in the magazines? I soon discovered, through tracking the trajectory of Chat magazine, that the construction of the real-life genre could be traced through the magazine's transformation. The magazine had originally set out to create content that told the readership all the news that affects women and families, but has now become the self-professed original real-life magazine, with the intention to, and I quote here, touch the reader and share an explosive conversation through heart-stopping moments and the wit and grit of real life, end quote. So here are some slides that will show you the transformation in a relatively short period of time. So Chat was launched in 1985, and it was the first mass market women's magazine to be launched since the 1950s. It was created to be a cross between a newspaper and a magazine. And true to their aims, Chat originally did cover topical news stories and informed the reader about how it would affect her, even interviewing Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in 1987. But I want to draw your attention to the very first issue of Chat magazine, and we can see how it achieves the cross between a newspaper magazine hybrid through tabloid quality paper that they use and the price point of 18p. Combined with the archetypes of women's magazines such as diet, celebrities, and gossips about the royals. So in this very first issue, in this first slide, Chat informs the reader about a strike happening called Wages for Housework, raising awareness to the free labour women undertake and asking them to unite and demand wages. They then ask well-known male celebrities rather than women on their perspective, even asking Prince Charles' opinion. Hardly revolutionary here, but thought-provoking compared to contemporary Chat, that here the magazine does inform women that domestic duties at home should not be undertaken for free, and that there were women who felt it could be monetized. Another article is about family income support benefit that many women were entitled to claim but were not being told about. As the headline says, don't be fiddled out of FIS. The rhetoric suggests that the government is deliberately obscuring information about the additional benefit, but that Chat, as the reader's friend, was protecting her against a crafty government and revealing what she could be entitled to. Here's another story from about the Department of Health and Social Security, who were in charge of benefits at that time, and how the reader could make sure she was receiving what she was entitled to. So how to get the best out of the DHSS. So there is a strong awareness from Chat that the readership of the magazine will need to claim state support, and that it might not be easy for her because of stringent government measures put in place to prevent people claiming. Chat also shows an awareness to the political turbulence of the era, and in this slide, the impact of the riots that were happening across the UK and how cars were being used as barricades. There's no judgment from Chat about whether the riots are good or bad or problematic, but it does inform the reader about what she could do if her car is used as a barricade. One final example I want to bring your attention to is that Chat even had a welfare rights correspondent that covered topical issues of the day and exposed wrongdoings that might affect the readership's life. So this example was about women being made to strip ahead of gynecological examinations, whereas those who had private healthcare were told to undress after an initial consultation. The article encourages readers to write in if they're shocked by this treatment, as they would be sending all correspondence to Norman Fowler, who was the Minister of Health at the time. So what all these examples illustrate is the role of chat to tackle topical issues, inform the readership, and a knowledge about the reader as a woman who would be affected by these issues covered, i.e. she may need to claim benefits and being caught up in the riots potentially. So it shows a clear acknowledgement from chat of the political, social, and economic turbulence, and a strong commitment to right any wrongdoing on the reader's behalf. Chat today, if we look at it, is in many ways the antithesis to what we've just seen. The slides, as we can see here in the slides, the bright, eye-catching front cover with vibrant first-person headlines that are often capitalized as if to shout at the reader about an interviewee's traumatic experience. They always have a model on the front cover, smiling beside these somewhat shocking headlines, such as "My evil dad sacrificed me to rapist pals," "Dead happy, how I put the fun into my own funeral," or "Let my scars be a lesson to you." Often the headlines are talking directly to the potential reader, and at the same time, we're expected to enjoy this with a smiling, happy model next to these somewhat troubling headlines. So early chat was interested in protecting mothers and telling them about the benefits that they could be entitled to. This is a very recent issue of Chat magazine, and we can see how they're writing stories about Britain's worst mums exposed, and highlighting all the horrific crimes that mums have actually committed in the UK. So it's clear that the magazine began to feature more traumatic stories from the readership's experience as the real life genre became consolidated. But I did need to substantiate these claims. So a systematic analysis of the cover content for Chat magazine, where 10% of issues each year were randomly sampled from the period 1985 to 2000. Real life stories were noted and coded as being either traumatic or not traumatic, and their themes logged and analysed. Issues were grouped into 3 periods for the analysis: the 1980s, the early to mid 90s, and the mid to late 90s. And the analysis found that for the 1980 sample, the majority of covers did not contain any real life stories. Covers typically featured a mix of celebrity interviews and competitions and advice pieces. All the sampled covers for the early to mid 1990s and the mid to late 90s contained real life stories on the cover, and the volume of these increased. The average number of real life stories for the 1980s sample was 0.44 per sampled issue, compared to 2.55 for the early to mid 90s, reaching nearly double that of 4.52 for the mid to late 90s sample. And also the nature of these stories changed. The 1980s, as I said, covers mostly did not feature real life stories, or when they did, there was only one story that was deemed quite traumatic in nature, in comparison to the early to mid 90s sample, where covers only featured stories that could be deemed quite traumatic. So among the more traumatic stories, the most prevalent themes across the whole sample were adultery, child death, and murder. Also common were family breakdowns, the loss of a child through removal or abduction, the death of an adult, and extreme violence. This analysis was essential as it supported the notion that as the genre became consolidated, traumatic experiences became the focal feature of the magazine. The data was coupled with a psychosocial methodology that sets out to understand social phenomena by drawing on psychoanalytic perspectives. I use this to analyze what may be the psychical effects of a social loss when it cannot be publicly grieved. As Stephen Frosch argues, this approach attempts to study psychic and social processes, and I quote here, as always implicated in each other as mutually constitutive, co-produced, or abstracted levels of a single dialectical process. So if social and material losses were internalized and have affected a subject's psychic life, how did these losses externally materialize? a psychosocial account of the real life genre can offer, and this is Frosch again, a way of understanding the intensity of emotion, the pervasiveness of fantasy, and the frequently profound irrationality of social life. It was this interplay between the social and the psychic that I wanted to explore, and Caroline Bainbridge and Candida Yates emphasize the role played by the media in responding to a subject's unconscious, and argue that, quote, by paying attention to the cultural and historical specificity of the media, it is possible to apply psychoanalytic discourse in a way that takes account of the psychological, cultural, and political complexities of contemporary cultural experience, end quote. So the real life genre began to be consolidated in 1990 with the launch of Take a Break. During this period, chat seems to emulate Take a Break, and I'll just show a slide here for you to see, changing its design within a month of Take a Break's launch. So in the middle here, we have what chat's been doing for 5 years. We can see with celebrity in the front, and then literally Take a Break on the right is launched, and then within 1 month, Chat magazine start changing its content, and also it even has the same car that you can win. So this is just the very beginnings of what soon became almost a competition between the two magazines. And as the period progresses, both magazines increased the real life content, and eventually a genre began to form when in 1995, That's Life was launched, followed by Pick Me Up, Real People, and Love It magazine. So here's just a selection of some of the magazines. That's Life's a real life magazine that tends to be focused at a younger demographic, still mums, but mums that are in their 20s and 30s. Take a Break, slightly older demographic, women in their 40s and 50s, and Real People is kind of a hybrid between them all. The thing that separates Real People from the others is, as you might see, they've got real people on their front cover. So they actually use people from the stories to try and sell the magazine, unlike Take a Break and the others, which have the smiling model. So Take a Break remains the market leader, and it sells a copy every second in the UK, sorry. Chat is the second best-selling women's weekly magazine and reaches over 935,000 consumers a week. Data from the National Readership Survey states that 423,000 women in the C2DE, a lower socioeconomic group, read Chat magazine compared to 169,000 ABC1 women. This suggests a link between the demographic who are consuming the magazine and their social categorization. Women identified as belonging to a lower socioeconomic category purchase Chat more than twice as much as those from middle to upper classes in the UK. So what was happening culturally and socially during this period when the real life magazine genre was forming? It is important to analyse the historical context to understand how the real life magazines can be seen to offer some form of sustenance and support for this, or potential support at least, for this C2DE demographic. So the late 1970s and the uptake of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party ideology was punitive for millions of people in the UK as the neoliberal worldview was consolidated and dispersed. Margaret Thatcher aimed to use economic methods, in her own words, to change the soul of Britain. Prior to her election, Britain and Western Europe had favoured state intervention in the economy, and this was considered conducive to a successful society. These ideals were consolidated with the creation of the welfare state in 1945, but in the late 1970s, the Conservative Party introduced neoliberal free market policies that aimed to dismantle or restructure much of what had gone before. These policies were intended to encourage strong entrepreneurial initiative and roll back much of the state intervention of the previous era. Margaret Thatcher's government, to quote David Harvey, confronted trade union powers, attacked all forms of social solidarity that hindered competitive flexibility, dismantled or rolled back the commitments of the welfare state, and created a favourable business climate. The effects of this radical social transformation should not be underestimated. The way of life for millions of people from the late 1970s onwards was altered, leading to the highest level of unemployment in any post-war period, when it rose from 1.2 million in 1980 to 3.2 million by 1983, and continued to remain high until the mid-1990s. The social disempowerment of the 1980s had the consequence that a large proportion of the traditionally working class population were no longer able to contribute or participate within society. As Stephen Frost states, the impact of these changes led to a society where so much that is precious, so much that people depend on, so much that had been fought for over generations, even the fragile and previous matter of being alive in a certain way, had been assaulted, uprooted, vicariously and irresponsibly crushed by a violently destructive force. End quote. So the restructuring of society in favor of competition and entrepreneurialism, alongside the reduction in state social provision, had a severe effect upon working class women. This is because, as Kelly Oliver notes, when social constraints contribute to the production of psychic pain, they may even exasperate it by barring its aesthetic expression, making the work of mourning even more remote for working class girls and mothers. End quote. Working class women hold even less power politically and socially than their middle class counterparts, and therefore cannot exert influence as easily. Their voices have been silenced by dominant and historical power structures concerning not only their gender, but also their social class. A former publishing director of Take a Break and That's Life, two of the leading real-life magazines, states that the readership of these magazines are, and I quote this, not aspirational in any way. These are working class women with money, relationship, or children worries, end quote. Perspectives such as this are troubling when considering real-life magazines as purveyors of powerful social ideologies, particularly when the readerships of real-life magazines are from the demographic most impacted with the changes to neoliberal society. Experiences of a punitive state are prevalent amongst this demographic, and the magazines know this through the responses they receive on social media. For example, reader Samantha Jones, and all the readers' quotes that I use here have changed their names, discusses how the media portrayal of those who need state support made her feel horrible when she required it, and she states, "When I finished year 12, my father was very ill and didn't have long to live. Mum suggested I go on benefits to help out because she left work to look after my dad and us as we were all young children. Watching stories like this made me feel horrible. I was like, are they calling me a bludger? I was at interviews the day my dad passed away, instead of being beside him and cherishing the last moments I had with him, thanks to the social security system, who even though they saw him with me a few days before he passed, they didn't seem to care. And I wrote for job placements, phoned businesses to see if they had vacancies, and even did door-to-door knocks. Then, when my unit closed in the job I'd held for 15 years, I had to go on benefits again, until I found my next job. And again, I remembered that day and that story and felt that people would consider me to be like someone who hadn't worked a day in their life." So this personal account appeared on That's Life's social media page, and the reader describes her diligence at trying to find employment and this shame she felt having to claim because of the media representation of benefit scroungers. The detail in this response almost appears as if the reader is justifying herself to other readers online, suggesting a sense of guilt and shame that she still experiences about having had to claim. For example, she states that the social perception was that she was a bludger, meaning a scrounger or a low-level thief, when she was tirelessly seeking employment and potentially with that social value. This reader is not alone. Take a Break similarly asked readers about a poll that had revealed how a third of workers spent all their income on essential living expenses and wanted to know if this reflected readers' lives. The responses included several examples of financial hardship and helplessness against an uncaring punitive state. One reader, Cheryl Williams, states, "I fully believe we're all in the same position, just surviving. I'm a gran and I've got 9 grandchildren and I'd love to go out and spend money on them. It breaks my heart that I can't, especially when other grandparents have loads of money. I just feel like the poor relations. We live on ESA and income support. I can't work as I have rheumatoid arthritis. I worked all of my life till I turned 54, and now I'm scrimping and saving, praying that I'll win the lottery. Life for me and thousands more are in the same position. The Conservative government have made it worse for all of us. It can't carry on. Another example is from reader Amy Christian, who also states, I was on ESA before I moved with my partner. Now I have zero income because the government says he can support me. He could barely support himself before now, and now we can't afford for him to drive his car every day to work, never mind fun things. I've had to cancel dentist appointments because we can't afford that, and forego buying electric radiators for the house we're renting. It doesn't have central heating, which is why it was cheap enough to afford the rent before they took my benefit. Not sure what we're going to do to keep warm or feed ourselves, to be honest. Never mind, have fun. And reader Julie Foley argues, it's disgusting that we have to work just to live, pay bills and have no money, hardly for food, just existing. I don't drink, smoke or go out. I can't afford to. The readers use words such as existing or just surviving in relation to their lives and detail how painful their lives are against the backdrop of increasing austerity measures that penalise those most in need. For example, Cheryl repeatedly states how life cannot go on as it is and how she prays that she wins the lottery. Cheryl also suggests the psychological effects of feeling like the poor relations and how she would love to go out and spend money on her grandchildren, but cannot. Similarly, Amy documents how, despite her partner working, they cannot afford a house with central heating or electric radiators, but that this was the cheapest rental option for her and her partner. Amy remains uncertain about how their lives can continue, as each day is a struggle to find food and keep warm, the most basic of needs. So the increasing fragmentation of communities, alongside the neoliberal assault on welfare dependency and the pervasive rhetoric of individual accountability for often structural and systemic failings, are significant factors that have affected the unconscious of many people. These conditions can be linked to what Rosalind Minsky notes is the widespread feelings of anxiety, insecurity, disconnection, lack of self-esteem, and helplessness. End quote. So what was lost socially can be seen to be gained within real-life magazines, such as a voice within the public domain. For instance, That's Life Stresses. It's a magazine, and I quote here, for our readers, by our readers. These economic, social, and structural hardships have found a resolution within real-life magazines, as the genre claims to be a supportive platform in which the interviewee can receive financial gain, and through this exchange, potentially combat feelings of helplessness or insecurity. For example, the Sell Us Your Story section on Love It magazine's website proposes, quote, sell us your story to love it, and you could earn enough for a fabulous family holiday. At Love It magazine, we care about our readers and we want to know about your lives, end quote. Through this rhetoric, the merging of financial gain and care may help conquer for a short period the interviewee's sense of financial and social helplessness. Take a Break similarly highlights that it's your magazine and we're interested in your lives. This rhetoric immediately suggests that the magazine is curious about their readership and wants to highlight their lives by giving them a voice. The magazine also claims that, quote, by dealing with us direct, you won't have to pay any agency fees and you'll be dealing with our staff who you can trust. The words trust suggest that if the reader sells her story, then she can have faith that the magazine will represent her experience positively, and this could be attractive to a reader in need. However, real-life magazines mask the growing social inequalities by encouraging underrepresented voices and experiences to be heard. This could be perceived as egalitarian and even positive if this voice was not mediated through a journalist and distilled through hegemonic neoliberal discourse under the banner of survivorship and empowerment, ignoring the structural complexities of these experiences and placing responsibility on the reader for its resolution. For example, That's Life asks the readership, are you a survivor or do you know someone who is? Did you have the courage to escape an abusive relationship and convict your ex in court? Would you like to share your story to raise awareness and help other women? If you have defied your fear to face a rapist in court or find the strength to leave a violent partner, we'd like to hear from you. Contact us today. You can email us or ring our confidential story hotline. We pay up to £2,000 for every story we print. So the words and expressions such as survivor, courage, defied your fear, and find the strength all create the impression of this potential interviewee as empowered, courageous, and even altruistic. Fewer than 10% of all reported domestic abuse cases end in prosecution, and this is a systemic failing. However, this is not revealed through the Real Life magazine rhetoric, which subtly implies that women whose former abusive partners are not prosecuted are weak and powerless. However, this rhetoric appeals to what Harkins argues is an attribute of neoliberal society, and that is characterized by an inward or domesticating narcissism. Real Life magazines replace growing social inequalities with personal experiences and contain this distress within the safety of a familial narrative. This is another means where the magazines can be seen to depoliticize and personalize what could be seen as the effects of an increasingly fragmentary and isolating society. Harvey argues how neoliberalism has entailed that everything can, in principle, be treated as a commodity. However, not everything or everyone is. Admittedly, the boundaries have become blurred since the success of reality television and talk shows that have appropriated the second wave of feminist slogan, "The personal is political." And as Rosalind Gill states, this post-feminist appropriation personalizes the political, subsuming and thus restraining the political or social specificities of the experience through individualistic narratives. So alongside this and an increasing rich-poor divide within Britain, working class communities similarly became increasingly fragmented through the far-reaching and all-encompassing dispersal of a neoliberal worldview. So I wanted to use that as the backdrop for what I'm going to move on to now, which is discussing melancholia. So I've discussed how the movement of neoliberal society was traumatic for millions of people. Julia Kristeva argues how periods of crisis, such as the period in question, creates the psychical conditions for melancholia to manifest. Kristeva argues, the periods that witness the downfall of political and religious idols, periods of crisis, are particularly favourable to Black moods. While it's true that an unemployed worker is less suicidal than a deserted lover, melancholia does assert itself in times of crisis. It is spoken of, establishes its archaeology, generates its representations and its knowledge, end quote. During this period, losses remolded and restructured society and by extension, subjective experience. At the same time, this loss was not granted full expression within the public domain. Instead, as I've argued, what was repeated was a pervasive neoliberal rhetoric that silenced the effects of structural changes through placing blame and responsibility upon those communities and individuals who failed to secure employment and depended on state support, as lazy scroungers and sponges of the state. Neoliberal rhetoric is pervasive and created lasting change from its inception. The ideology emphasized the personal attributes of resilience and promoted individualism, and that these values were repeated across diverse mediums until they created a new discourse and worldview, neoliberalism. However, once a loss has been experienced socially but barred from symbolic expression, it creates the psychical conditions for the production of melancholia to assert itself, to speak. I would suggest that the numerous social losses triggered through neoliberalism have not been mourned, and this phenomenon can be elucidated through a return to Sigmund Freud's notion of melancholia. Freud argues in Mourning and Melancholia that melancholia manifests itself because the full extent of a loss remains unknown to consciousness. The same conditions that often lead to the work of mourning can instead result in melancholia. As Freud notes, melancholia can develop not only in relation to the loss of a loved one, but also through, quote, an abstraction taking the place of the person, such as fatherland, freedom, an ideal, and so on, end quote. What Freud makes clear is the innumerable causes where instead of mourning, melancholia arises. Freud argues, quote, it is difficult to see what has been lost, so we may rather assume that the patient cannot consciously grasp what he has lost. Indeed, this might also be the case when the loss that is the cause of melancholia is known to the subject, when he knows who it is, but not what it is about that person that he has lost, end quote. So melancholia then becomes the unconscious acting out of this loss. Melancholia can illuminate not only the effect of loss on the subject, but also offer a framework to understand how far innumerable social losses have affected subjects at large within society. This is because losses of a more ideal kind affect not just an individual, but reverberate throughout the society. The effects of members of society most vulnerable to the social, economic, and political losses of the 80s have not become easier to bear. Over the last 30 years, inequality has increased and is now experienced across a global stage, compounded by the financial crisis of 2008 and now the coronavirus. The initial loss of a more ideal kind was an identification with the state as benevolent and supportive, that many could depend on for protection. New policies that were introduced penalised those who are vulnerable, reinforcing Kelly Oliver's point that, quote, it's not just that those othered are excluded from positions of power and not accepted as fully rational, autonomous subjects, but that also their very experiences of exclusion are rarely allowed articulation or signification within mainstream culture, end quote. For many people during this period, at stake was not only the loss of an identification with the state and what that's come to represent, but also a platform to express and signify these losses. Strikingly, during this period, alongside increasing inequalities, was the promotion of the ideology that within the market, every subject was equal. However, as the Real Life magazines implicitly reveal, this is not accurate, as it's only women from a lower socioeconomic background who seem to feature in these publications. These social losses experienced in the 1980s led, in Britain, to the creation of a society where some losses were allowed into production and thus exposure within the public domain, and others were silenced. Those silent voices, however, have sought a new way to be heard. This is suggestive of what Freud stresses as an attribute of melancholia, in that it, quote, behaves like an open wound, drawing investment energies to itself from all sides, end quote. So one of the key ways in which this has happened is through Real Life magazines, where an already forming social melancholia became manifest, behaving similarly to an open wound, needing to be spoken about, repeated and displaced week after week through the same themes recycled, never finding fulfillment. The repetition of similar stories featured within Real Life magazines responds to Freud's notion of melancholia, another trait being, according to Freud, of and I quote here, an insistent talkativeness that takes satisfaction from self-exposure, end quote. So Real Life magazines exemplify this characteristic as the genre is created from interviewees who want to voice their personal experiences of trauma and loss. However, this need is arguably exploited by Real Life magazines, who appropriate and then mediate the interviewee's voice as if it were her own voice. The interviewee's voice is silenced once more through these magazines, which reproduce dominant discourses of gender and class through the journalist's representation. Despite this, the interviewee's loss is insistent and incessantly seeks exposure. Melancholia is generative because there is an unknowability of what has been lost to the subject's consciousness, and in many ways can lead to an acting out and displacement of that loss. This arguably can be seen through Real Life magazines, as in the words of Earl Hoppers, situations characterized by extreme helplessness tend to be repeated. It may be that for interviewees, their expulsion from a neoliberal society through the increasingly punitive rhetoric around gender and class may have led to the internalization of that violence against their sense of self and self-worth, making them vulnerable to the seductive rhetoric of Real Life magazines. As Minsky reiterates, quote here, in a consumer society, if some people are denied access to goods available to most people because of low pay, unemployment, job insecurity, like the child who is emotionally neglected or abused in the family, they are turned into outsiders with poor self-esteem and few means of participating in culturally accepted means of bolstering identity. Denial of access to consumer goods, which the rest of us can take for granted in a society based on consumption, represents a form of cultural emotional abuse, which may well be externalized in violence against the self or others. End quote. So these factors may contribute towards an interviewee's desire to appear within a Real Life magazine. If an event has been too traumatic to consciously address, or in fact prohibited exposure, a requisite for the process of symbolization to begin, then the psychical effects will persist within the unconscious. This repressed loss will arguably form and structure the symbolic necessity for restaging the event through whatever sublimated means available. So now I'm going on to discuss how this social melancholia has become productive through its tendency towards sublimation. And I will discuss how this has led to the formation of a melancholic community who are bonded through their purchases of Real Life magazines. So as we've seen, Real Life magazines mobilize a rhetoric of care and potential economic sustenance for the interviewee. In the short term, these elements provide the emotional empathy and financial support that many may have lost with the turn towards neoliberalism. This could be the reason why the interviewee readership participate within the magazines and purchase them, as they offer a platform where this demographic seems to be listened to, cared and provided for. The effects of Real Life magazines then could be said to have resulted in the formation of a community. As Oliver states, those who have become excluded from society, quote, are not allowed to become individuals who belong to the community. Rather, they are excluded as inferior beings who do not belong or belong only as an objective being who serves the needs of others, end quote. The failure to publicly acknowledge the magnitude of these losses meant that the grieving process necessary for closure could not begin. If there is no public acknowledgement of political and ultimately social losses, then melancholia can manifest itself and become a productive force in the creation of specific group formations. As David N. states, if, for instance, there's no public language by which a loss could be recognized, then melancholia assumes a social dimension of contemporary consequence that must be acknowledged and analyzed as a problem of the political. This attention to the social dimensions of melancholia insists on thinking of the dis-ease less as an individual pathology than as a model of group formation. So in melancholia, the loss is withdrawn from consciousness. This does not mean, however, that the loss is unproductive. On the contrary, as Zizek stresses, in the process of loss, there's always a remainder that cannot be integrated through the work of mourning. And the ultimate fidelity is the fidelity to the remainder. Mourning is a kind of betrayal, the second killing of the lost object, while the melancholic subject remains faithful to the lost object, refusing to renounce his or her attachment to it, end quote. Melancholia is the socially productive force behind Real Life magazines because through experiences of loss, object or ideal, there is an excess, a remainder that cannot be known nor contained. It's the excess of the interviewee's experience that has led to the creation of a melancholic community through the transmission of her experience to the reader. So what exceeds signification through the story ties the reader and interviewee by their shared historical and social experiences that were prohibited exposure. Teresa Brennan discusses how affect is transmitted and states, we're not self-contained in terms of our energy, there is no secure distinction between the individual and the environment. Real Life magazines have a target demographic constituted of women who have been identified as belonging to lower socioeconomic categories. The interviewee is from the target audience and thus satisfies the claims of the genre as being representative of reality. The interviewee is from the same social environment as the reader and vice versa. So as illustrated through the rhetoric of That's Life, by submitting her own experiences or photographs, That's Life permits readers to become part of the magazine, the community. This rhetoric highlights the symbiosis between reader and interviewee, and through this affective link bonds the two. The affect of the interviewee's stories resonates with shared collective experiences and ultimately feelings produced through and from the social environment. As Margaret Wetherell notes, if affect is a kind of chaotic excess and an unprocessed push, then the moment of discursive representation is bureaucratic and organizational. For Mizumi, it is the process by which potentially wild affect is tamed, turned into something people can recognize, talk about to each other, and communicate as domesticated emotion. Through the Real Life story's construction, affect may have been tamed, but that does not mean that affect is docile and unproductive. The opposite occurs in that this excess must also have an excess, something that exceeds the story that cannot be signified through language. This does not mean that the personal experience is irrelevant. However, it is suggestive of the ways in which a melancholic community can form, despite the differences between the readership's life experiences, because there's a unifying thread of affect that bonds reader and interviewee. As Emma Hutchison notes, by giving voice to or visually depicting what are unique and somewhat incommunicable experiences of shock and pain, representational practices craft understandings of trauma that have social meaning and are significant. In particular circumstances, such practices and the shared meanings that are produced resonate with shared culturally ascribed notions of mutual bereavement, loss, and solidarity. A community bound by shared understandings may ensue. So the excess of loss cannot be restrained and instead seeks to produce representations through insistent self-exposure, particularly in times of crisis. The interviewee's self-exposure gives rise to significant shared social meanings that, though not articulable in the magazine, are nevertheless felt by the readership. This leads in turn to the creation of a community bonded by affective social ties. Brennan reminds us that affect can be triggered through collective experiences, as the boundaries between individual and environment are not distinct. The losses experienced during the 80s were not only individual, but had political and social ramifications. The affect produced through social change is both individual and historical in that, and this is from Brennan, the thoughts that I attach to the effect remain my own. They remain the product of a particular historical conjunction of worlds and experiences that I represent. End quote. So the thoughts and experiences of a reader or interviewee are determined both socially and historically. How the reader incorporates or responds to the interviewee's experience is formed from our own direct perception of the social world. Experiences of trauma and loss, however, are productive for the Real Life magazine's demographic, as these subjects were most affected by the loss of previous social ideals and policies, and the expression of this has been prohibited within the public domain. Furthermore, these governmental policies had lasting effects, which is suggestive of why the Real Life magazine have sustained their popularity across 3 decades. As Alex Scott Samuel and Claire Bamborough note, Thatcher's legacy includes the unnecessary and unjust premature death of many British citizens, together with a substantial and continuing burden of suffering and loss of well-being, end quote. The affective remainder exceeds the individual's experience of loss or trauma, and because it's unknown to consciousness, it becomes the productive force behind the creation of Real Life magazines. Symbolically, they can be seen in many ways as the antidote to what was lost. The demographic can have a voice, money, and form part of the community of readers. So this leads me on to my conclusion. So Real Life magazines constantly repeat the emotional ordeal of the interviewee. The women featured have been identified as belonging to lower socioeconomic categories, and therefore how they are represented must be analysed in relation to dominant power structures. There's no other representation the interviewee can receive within this commodity. All others are silenced. The social ideals and identifications lost during the 1980s were quickly replaced with the all-pervasive neoliberal economic and social rhetoric. And melancholia became a psychical model for group formation because the effect of loss remained unrecognised within the social sphere and for the individual. Through lasting and increasing social disempowerment, melancholia became materially productive. It was a response to the social and political climate that demanded to be heard. Through the expression of an interviewee's trauma, the readership can identify with the feelings as speaking to their experiences of life within a society determined to silence their voices and neglect their needs. Instead of these losses being mourned and eventually overcome, melancholia has become manifest as there is no public recognition, let alone a language to account for the effects of neoliberal ideology on those most vulnerable. Today, during COVID-19 pandemic, where many magazines have folded and others are struggling to survive, Real Life magazines are thriving, with Take a Break selling 1 million first-hand copies each week. The success of Real Life magazines continues to suggest that the psychical demands for these magazines exceeds any use value. The magazines have maintained their popularity precisely because they were birthed from an emerging social melancholia that continues to haunt, incessantly seeks exposure, but fails each time, that keeps the psychical wound alive as the magazine genre continues to survive and thrive on these traumatic first-person ordeals from those most vulnerable to the neoliberal worldview. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I wonder if you might be happy to stop your share so that we can bring you back to the site. That would be great.
Oh yeah, that button there. Yes.
it's such a shame at this point that we can't all give you the round of applause, but I can see lots of kind of applause coming up in terms of the Zoom reactions, which you have to imagine inside your mind. Really, really loads to talk about there. So, but you and I have talked a lot about your work. So I'm going to, first of all, see whether there is anybody who has a question for Lucy or a response to her paper. I can see that we've got thanks coming in the chat. I mean, one thing that struck me as people gather their thoughts before we go to the discussion is what you touched on there at the end around COVID-19 and the COVID context. Absolutely fascinating that sales have just rocketed, as you say.
Yeah.
I wondered if the magazines are actually covering COVID and the experience of COVID, or if it's actually still more of the same kind of, as it were, traumatic experience around, you know, these quite often quite perverse kind of tales that are told. But I wondered if they're actually touching on COVID traumas as well.
Yeah, I've been keeping a close eye on what the magazines are doing at this particular moment. So, but they aren't actually talking about COVID, and I think the reason why they're not doing like real life stories about COVID-19 is probably because it's actually really common, and they don't generally cover things that are, you know, really, really common because it doesn't have that shock value. So I'm not sure if it, you know, they might do if there was a particularly emotionally charged story. I'm sure they would probably cover it, but generally I think they're moving away. They're not covering it just now. And or it could be, I mean, that's just my thoughts. It could maybe be that perhaps because we're in it, they're wanting to give people other stories to escape into. That could be another option, I suppose, but I haven't seen any.
Yeah, that's really interesting, this idea that there has to be this kind of curious kind of originality angle in order for it to make the editorial pick, I suppose.
Yeah, they do. There's like when you're working in the industry, you and particularly when you're selling to magazines, you learn there's a kind of like unspoken scale of what's too gratuitous, what is just the right amount. That, you know, some things are too, you know, they're not for public consumption. Other things they need to be beefed up a little bit, and you sort of learn that through selling so many real life stories, the kind of scale that they have. In general, it's the same themes that are recycled, and that's kind of what I knew intuitively, but I managed to sort of talk about in the thesis. And that's kind of because they're common, but and all the stories end up sounding very similar, but they're the same topics that get covered repeatedly. So things like COVID, it might maybe next year, perhaps, maybe then when it's more, we're not in the thick of it, maybe they might have some sort of reaction then, but just now they certainly don't.
Yeah, Freud would say that we need to wait for that reminder of the traumatic moment. So yeah, there's a question in the chat which is from Banda around. She'd like to ask how you read the future of magazines in the era of social media.
That's really, yeah, that's a great question. I was actually thinking about this just the other day. I think print generally is going downhill, but the good thing about real life magazines from my perspective is that they have such a buoyant online community, and things like chat now you can get on your apps, you can download them, you can get subscriptions to them that way. And that's something that they're constantly trying to encourage. They did research that most of Chat Magazine's readers, they didn't have computers, but they had to have tablets. So that's why they've made like their app really easy to read on a tablet device. The community that you see on particularly That's Life social media page is phenomenal. They're constantly, you know, asking what stories they want, and they're always really kind of stories about, you know, abuse, rape, domestic violence, constantly with financial incentives to prompt someone to actually get in touch with them. And I was talking to a friend of mine who works at That's Life, and it does sometimes actually generate in actually stories, but often again people think they have a story and they often don't. They need to have a journalist to sort of make it a real life story, I suppose. So yeah, I think even though print sales are declining, I think because they've got such a healthy online following, I think that they're going to continue to be successful.
It's that kind of idea of the kind of secret pleasure as well, isn't it? The touch, the actual physical touch of the object.
Yeah.
constructs kind of intimacy, I think.
Yeah, I was surprised when I found out that Take a Break, like, it's always been a super successful magazine since it was launched. It's always really gripped its readership, and I was surprised to hear that even in COVID times, when I know of other magazines that have sadly folded, that they're doing superbly well. I can only think it's because of the community that they've fostered since the 90s. If you're alone, stuck at home, oh, I've got my mag, that's my friend. I mean, Chat magazine even used to have as a headline, a subheading, the magazine that's your friend. So, they do try and have that intimate relationship with the reader. I don't think that's specific to Real Life, but it's something that is pronounced in that genre as well.
Thanks, Lucy. I can see that there's questions coming in. I'm wondering if people would like to actually unmute and ask their questions. Ivana, I don't know whether you'd like to speak to your question. I appreciate sometimes people aren't able to unmute. I think Ivana, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks, Lucy, for your presentation. Well done. I was going to ask you, like, obviously, do you have any suggestions in terms of like how some of these issues can actually be fixed? Because obviously there is a demand for these magazines, just due to the amount of people that read them. And yeah, but in other ways, in an ideal society, there wouldn't really exist. So I'm just wondering, like, if you have any suggestions, or have you looked at that side of things at all in terms of, could these magazines be more regulated? How these stories are actually captured? How would you, what would you suggest?
I think thank you very much, Ivana. That's a good question. I think what my concern about the Real Life magazines is the role of the journalist in appropriating the experience of the interviewee. So I think maybe one way of going about it would be to actually encourage those who have experienced these ordeals to potentially write their own. That would be one way. At least it would be a true expression rather than a sort of appropriation of an experience that's gone through, as I said, many different structures. But I'm not sure if you can't just say I'd like to get rid of them all because they're so popular. That's the thing, people love them. There's other aspects to Real Life magazines as well as community, like there's also crosswords and prizes. That's something that's also attractive to readership, because again, if the promise of winning, thousands of pounds, there's even chat bingo, that if you buy Chat magazine, you can sign up online for chat bingo. So they do encourage like a lot of gambling and things like that as well, because they know that the demographic is from, would be looking to try and make money, as Cheryl said in the talk. She just wishes she could win the lottery. So.
I see that there's also questions from Catherine Martin and then from Mike Clark, and I wondered if you'd like to speak to them. Catherine, are you able to address your question?
Oh, yeah, I've managed to close the door where my other half is also in a meeting. Thank you so much for this talk, Lucy. It was really fascinating. I was curious, so I'm coming from a US context, and I'm interested in how this genre seems to have emerged around the same time and for the same social needs as like shows that we still have in the US, like the Jerry Springer Show, and more, that kind of like find out if this is your baby daddy. These shows got really popular in the US, and then there was this massive conservative effort to censor them. And like this backlash, and obviously there's some element of broadcasting being a limited spectrum, but I was wondering if there has been a similar backlash against these magazines, and how you deal with that kind of squishy area where, like, yes, these magazines are, you've shown they can be very harmful, but they also give people a way to speak, and the catch-22 of neoliberal popular media.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a really great question as well. There's been quite a lot of not protest, but like online kind of, there's been like a kind of ban real life magazines, because one of the things that some people find problematic about real life magazines is they're on like eye level of young children on the magazines, like in the supermarket or the newsagent. You can see them, so children can see these headlines and things like that. And there was a similar, you know, like when they were wanting to ban page 3, there was a similar ban real life magazines. It never really took hold, particularly. I mean, they're still around, so it obviously didn't work. But I think, you know, yeah, it is interesting. So it all comes around, and also the genre of sort of fiction that was coming out around about the 90s, where, you know, there was like all these horrible, you know, first-person accounts of abuse by nuns and things like that. It all kind of comes together to form this. There's one element is real life magazines. But interestingly, in the American context, there was a magazine in the 60s, I think, and 70s. It might even still be around today. That's called True Story.
I mean, because that's been around. I want to say variations of that have been around since the 30s. And I'm not sure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I remember one of my earlier research ideas was, oh, is this the same as like the American like True Story? So I was kind of trying to bring them up, but yeah, they're not. But True Story did actually claim to be written by the people who'd experienced like their husband having an affair or something like that. But then I think many years later it got busted that actually it was just writers that they got in. But it's quite interesting in that context when I was trying to find a link, like obviously neoliberalism in the States, neoliberalism in the UK, what's happening similarly, what's the differences. And I thought, oh, this could be a little hook, but you know, but it was interesting to find out.
It's a fascinating comparison, but it doesn't always.
Yeah, it doesn't work exactly.
It doesn't have to be all about the US.
I think,
well, thank you.
I know that Anita Beresti has had to leave early, but she made a comment linked to this in the chat, Catherine, around
the crossover true crime. Yeah.
And I know that Anita has published a book on that you might be interested in. True crime magazines and the kind of, you know, the extent of consumption by women is really fascinating.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that.
So Mike Clark, are you able to speak to your question?
Yes, thanks, Lucy. That was really fascinating. I was struck by the visual presentation of those 3 covers, which were visible for a lot of the talk. And you mentioned Christava's idea of darkness and melancholia, and yet the sheer amount of colour and the visual presentation on those covers. And I wondered if there was any progression in that over time, that these things are quite dark stories, they're quite difficult stories, but they're in bright pink and baby blue and yellow and occasionally a little bit of red. And I wonder if you've got any thoughts about how that's changed over time and how the kind of visual impact of it, beyond the models on the cover that you did mention, but how the visual presentation has changed and shifted over time as well. Yeah,
that's a really interesting question too. It does change really from about, I'd say like 1990 to about 1994, it's kind of getting consolidated, the genre, and they do try doing a lot of different things. They'll have some issues that are just covered in headlines, and then they'll have other ones that are like maybe darker colors. And you can kind of see when you're in the British Library looking through the history of these magazines, like how they do visually start changing. But I have to say, from about like 95, they're pretty consistent in how they look, and they always have this like really bright, shocking colors, which is probably to attract the eye. And then this bright, you know, supposedly average looking model smiling to get you to kind of enjoy these kind of, I think it's because if it didn't have that, it had a gloomy looking person, maybe you wouldn't want to buy it. You'd be like, oh, this is dark, it's maybe something that I shouldn't be wanting to enjoy. But because obviously they're wanting people to buy the magazine, it's almost like giving them validation, like, yeah, you can, come on, read it, it's fun, it's good. So it doesn't change too much in terms of the fact that they do use bright colors, primary colors, a lot of pink. I mean, this is why it's gendered as well. When you look at it in the actual thesis, I did do textual analysis and things like that to talk about the gendered aspect to it. But yeah, that's really interesting. It doesn't go from like dark to light or anything. They've always kind of been shocking in terms of the colors that they use. And I do think it's because it maybe stems from the kind of tabloid heritage that the chat was coming out of, you know, shocking kind of stories to get that sort of pop with the eye. Come and buy it, it's only 38p or whatever it was at the time.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Lucy. Are there any other comments or questions that we'd like to raise. I know some of you may not be in favour of using the chat. Do just wave at your screen or unmute and speak if you can't have your screen on.
I just saw that question about true crime, and actually just in the past couple of years, That's Life have even created their own true crime magazine because of the demand of true crime. It's like taking off so much. Again, that's interesting to think, why now is this becoming such a big deal? It's definitely something that I think about quite a lot, especially with all the documentaries you see on Netflix, and yeah, the real life now getting involved. I think Bauer had a exclusively true crime magazine launched just last year as well, so they're picking up on it, the desire for this.
The connection you make to Netflix there is really, really interesting, and thinking about, you know, the extraordinary success of shows like Making a Murderer and things like that. And I don't know if you've come across the work of the feminist media scholar Tanya Horek, based at Anglia Ruskin University, and she talks in really interesting ways about the actual real life communities that build up around the show Making a Murderer, in which, you know, people try to actually solve this crime and see themselves as the kind of carriers of the imperative towards justice being done and so on. And it's like a kind of fantasy life enactment, which it's kind of like the next step, isn't it, from what you were so convincingly observing as the melancholic community and that feeling of being in touch, kind of stepping over into this kind of weird kind of semi-fictional, like Batman heroic kind of role of, you know, justice will be served kind of thing.
Yeah, that reminds me that the lawyer came to Aberdeen on a kind of road trip. I just
Oh really?
Loads of people came to her and they're like, yeah, we're going to get him out of prison.
I wonder if, is there lots of, to come back to that idea about social media, is there lots of chat about how people feel about what they've read on the social media channels for these?
Yeah, that's again, it's everyone's asking for a good thing, but yeah, sometimes people will say, often some of the magazines, they do kind of particularly take a break. They might do a follow story, so they might follow a mum who's been diagnosed with breast cancer, say, and she's documenting her, or her child who's ill, and they document her stint in hospital. They've done that, and often the community gets in touch then going, what's happened with so and so? We didn't see her column this week, or we didn't see, how's she doing, sending her love, is she okay? And, you know, and the story that I'm talking about specifically just now, unfortunately the woman did pass on, and so when that happened there was a big collective, almost like grieving process. People couldn't believe that, you know, she'd gone, and how touching her story had been. So online in that sense there was a kind of, and also often what you'll find is the people who are appearing in that week's issue will go on That's Life social media page and say, oh, I'm on it, I'm in it today. And then often you'll have other people going, oh, I really like that story, or are you okay now? Or so this is where often you get the sense of the community that they're interacting with one another as readers. So yeah, they do seem to comment. Most often it is about appearing in the magazine themselves, but there are moments when they collectively come together to sort of.
That's really interesting. Lots of fascinating data for you online as well, then, for further research, I guess.
Yeah, I've got so much.
Collecting narratives.
Yeah.
Is there anything else anyone wants to bring up?
The discussion of true crime had me thinking about true crime podcasts, because my friend Amanda Keeler has done a lot of research on true crime podcasts, and just the sense of intimacy that comes through those. And I was wondering, have they expanded it into podcasting at all, or any sort of, like, you know, it feels like that's almost the next step of this community where people can actually pretend they're speaking to each other.
Yeah, it totally does sound like the next step. They haven't done it so far that I'm aware of. I'm sure it's probably something they're thinking about, because you're right, like podcasts are just skyrocketing, aren't they? So I'm just imagining that it won't be long. But I mean, the magazines were quite slow to actually get a website and then to get even online. So they're good, because a lot of the readership are a bit older, and I mean, they just didn't really move with the times probably quick enough. But now, as I said, That's Life in particular is maybe because they're aimed at a younger demographic slightly, they're just zooming online. It's really phenomenal.
Yeah, but they've got to wait till their readership is there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, if there are no further questions or points for discussion, would you please join with me in choosing your preferred reaction for Lucy, and or even unmuting and giving her an actual round of applause. Thank you so much, Lucy. It was really
Thank you for having me.
We really appreciate you making time to come and deliver your talk about your fascinating work, and wish you every success with it. And I'm sure it's going to find publication home very, very soon. We look forward to that, and certainly circulate it when it's ready and add it to our teaching lists.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed sharing today. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming as well.
And thank you, indeed, for joining. I have been recording the session, so we'll look around making that available, and letting people know if you'd like to follow up on that. And also, if anybody would like contact details for Lucy, please feel free to contact me and I can put you in touch with her. Okay, thanks so much, everyone. Have a lovely evening. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.